Now, political parties and the KZN government have been grappling with the recent surge in killings in the province following changes in coalition agreements, at least in places like Nongoma. Police Minister Bheki Cele recently reported that over 300 people have been arrested for political killings in the province alone. It's also been reported that at least 19 councilors have been killed in KZN since the beginning of September. A KZN man has been sentenced to 25 years in jail for murder of IFP councillors. Let's make sense of all these developments for you, especially in the lead up to next year's elections. Bring in political analyst Jackie Shandu, who joins us via our video link this morning. Grateful for your time, Jackie. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. You know, the police minister is clearly talking tough on criminals, and I imagine he's also including in this those who are after political leaders in KZN. But this is a long-standing issue, and it doesn't feel like there's any kind of end to it. Is there enough political will to get this right?
Good morning to you, and good morning to the viewers of Newzroom Afrika, and thank you for having me. Look, it's now beyond the question of will. It's now more about the reality of complete lack of capacity to nip this very deadly scourge in the bud. And I just want to give you some context. Remember, being a councillor gives you a seat in those municipal councils and gives you an influence in terms of the drawing up of budget, in terms of allocation of big tender awards, to certain contractors or service providers that do business with that tier of the state, which is the local state. And in rural communities, in particular in KZN, that is more often than not the only way toward meaningful economic activities, in particular for those emerging and even established tenderpreneurs in those areas. And the existence of certain ward councillors is the only guarantee for those individuals who exist as tenderpreneurs or for those companies. And in turn, for those councillors, that is the only way to perhaps supplement their rather modest earnings as ward councillor with these kickbacks, sometimes very lucrative, because some of those contracts runs into hundreds of thousands of rands and tens of millions. So you have to understand that reality, that broader reality within which this scourge has sort of developed and intensified. So maybe it's even a misnomer to characterize them as mere political killings at this time. You could call them financial or economic killings. You could call those ones economic hitmen, or henchmen, because the centrality of this scourge is around the scramble for resources, particularly in these very remote rural areas where there is a chronic, massive unemployment, and it also speaks to the broader one would say macroeconomic realities of this country, where urban areas, in a sense, are prioritized as centers of economic activities. And for the longest time, rural areas have been, as it were, completely neglected. So I think that there's so many nuances to tease into this very, very important scourge of politically and economically related killings. And we need to have a broader conversation. I think that thus far the discourse has been very superficial.
That's interesting. And I wonder what you reckon a solution in that context may look like. And it's still very early, and I suppose we won't have any specifics. But in my mind, we do one of two things. It's either we really do beef up our ability to find people who are involved in this kind of crime, and I suppose that's a much broader ambition, or we try find a way where we create systems that allow councillors to only be involved in governance and not necessarily things that have financial implications. I wonder how possible the latter is.
Look, I suppose those interventions can assist but they have grave limitations simply because they do not accurately and comprehensively diagnose the problem. You know, it's like basically taking a Panado, you know, or some form of painkiller as an immediate intervention when you are feeling a lot of pain as a temporary relief, but you still have to get to the root of the illness. And in my mind, this speaks to systemic inequality, economic inequality, structural, institutional inequality, economic racism that is so pervasive in South Africa that in the main, black people, we've just seen the census report being released, the 2022 census report being released less than a month ago, and black people account for more than 90%, a staggering 90% of the population of this country. But wealth patterns, land ownership patterns, economic ownership stats, you know, show you that the vast majority of blacks in general, but Africans in particular, who alone constitute a staggering 80% of total population, are left to fend for themselves without institutions, without environment. I mean, if you talk about employment statistics, for example, youth employment going as up high, approaching levels of 70% unemployment, and the bulk of that youth unemployment being in rural areas. So I'm saying, if you have interventions that do not speak to the inequality that is so systemic, that is so structural and institutional in this country, that would not ultimately solve the problem. I do believe that the problem do lie in a set of solutions, and key among them is a comprehensive plan of, today they call it economic inclusivity. In the last decade or so, it was called radical transformation. Coming into 1994, it was called a reconstruction and development program. But it is really about redistribution of wealth and income earning patterns and democratization and even in terms of the geographic spread of economic development and economic participation in the country.
You know, there is a saying in Zulu that indlala ibangulaga, and if we are to accept what you're saying, then I'm afraid we're still left with a couple more questions, right? Including why it is that this is so pervasive, specifically in KwaZulu Natal, especially because the socio-economic issues that you highlighted are not unique to that province.
No, that's correct. But also there are other different factors. For example, KwaZulu Natal is, I think, provincially is the second contributor to the GDP. In fact, if we were to do a proper analysis of the structure and patterns of the economy of this country, you'd understand that nearly 70% of the gross domestic product of this country essentially comes from three provinces. Number one is Gauteng, number two is KZN, and thirdly, the Western Cape. That is really the center of the wealth, of economic activity, and of development in this country. So what really happens is people in KwaZulu-Natal do not necessarily build their socio-economic aspirations around what may be happening in Tanin or in Tanzania. They look at the monstrous wealth. If you are in eThekwini, for example, the thousands of cargo and the billions of rands or dollars that are exchanged as those vessels come into the country, or some of them leave the country, manufactured cars coming from abroad, going via train, a lot of goods that come into this country, nearly 90% of them through the port of eThekwini. They look at the massive farms, even in northern KZN. So they can see the massive wealth that is being created and that they are being necessarily excluded from meaningful participation in. They can see the resorts, mega resorts, worth billions of rands that are being built along the coastline, for example, and the very opulent suburbs that are being built, and people enjoying really what can be characterized as high income first world country lifestyles, and they can see this disparity playing themselves out even in the kind of schools that their children go to vis-a-vis these very luxurious schools for the children of the elite, which attract even students from all over the world, including many first world countries. So there must be some will to look at the scourge within the macroeconomic, socio-political framework. I mean, if you look at even the budgets, we're speaking about councilors, and this mainly affects councils. They look at these annual budgets and the tens of millions, the hundreds of millions, the billions that are always available at the end of at the beginning of the financial year, as the executive mayors and others, municipal managers. They look at, for example, supply chain division within those municipalities, and how much money is being paid, how many more tenders are being allocated, and the question does arise, and I don't think it's completely invalid. Why them and not us? And who are these people? And in some instances, you find that they are recurrent beneficiaries.
Right.
It's a small clique of companies, if not individuals, that perennially benefit from these procurement processes. So those questions have to be incorporated into this much larger discourse.
Certainly.
Of wanting to get to the bottom of how these killings actually emerge. Because all the answers about how to completely arrest, if not entirely eliminate this scourge, lie in the proper diagnosis of the problem, as it were.
Sure, an intersectional kind of lens to try and unpack what's taking place. It's like, in fact, people are calling for that kind of approach, even in understanding what is being described as a construction mafia in parts like KwaZulu Natal. But Jackie Shandu, thanks very much for your time. Really do appreciate your insights on the AM report today. Jackie Shandu, of course, speaking to us there as a political analyst.